Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, the oldest character in the game, and the first licensed killer to ever come to the game outside of a full chapter release. Bubba Sawyer, better known as Leatherface or the Cannibal. In the grand and storied history of Dead by Daylight licensed collaborations, Leatherface stands out as a particularly strange example. Because instead of getting a full chapter release like pretty much every other licensed killer, he was sort of squeezed into a mid-chapter release known as a paragraph between Chapter 5, A Lullaby for the Dark, and the Halloween release, Chapter 6, A Nightmare on Elm Street. Whereas Halloween before it and The Nightmare after it both received a full complement of content, a killer, a survivor, and a map, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre just brought Leatherface as a killer, and his release wasn't exactly celebrated. From his power being pretty much the worst killer power in the game at the time of release, and the add-ons of his chainsaw mostly just being reiteration to the Hillbilly's add-ons, Bubba was kind of unremarkable at best and pretty shitty at worst, when he wasn't face camping at least. And it took his rework alongside the Hillbilly in the autumn of 2020 for him to be an actually good killer for the first time in his life. But even during the years where Bubba was just terrible, there was a level of charm to him, a love-hate relationship that DBD players seemed to have to him, that I think demonstrated something quite special about his relationship to DBD and its community, and it becomes a lot more interesting when you bear in mind Bubba's source material and what the original plans were for his release. Today, we'll be talking about what makes Leatherface so special. But before we go any further, I'd like to talk to you about Manscaped, the sponsor for this video out to transform men's hygiene and grooming for good. If there's one thing I know about Dead by Daylight players, it's that they value nothing more than personal hygiene. This is a straight face I'm doing. And Manscaped is the key to giving your family jewels the royal treatment they deserve. Manscaped's massive variety of men's hygiene products means that there'll be something for everyone, like this fantastic Lawnmower 4.0 cordless shaver that's designed to let you safely and conveniently trim any hair on your body. But I'm a big fan of the Crop Preserver liquid deodorant because there's no such thing as not enough body odour. And everything I've just talked about comes in this, the very convenient Perfect package. So it's got all the stuff in here. In here goes a pair of specially designed boxers, which right now I'm currently wearing. Bit of consumer advice there for the boxers. If you're going to pick them up, go for a size bigger than you think you need because it can be a little snug in places. You can order this or anything else from Manscaped's substantial catalogue by using the link in the description and the pinned comment and using code PIXELB20 for 20% off at checkout. Oh, and free shipping. It supports the channel and gets you an excellent deal on whatever men's hygiene products you desire at the same time. It's a win-win really. Now back to Leatherface. As I often do in these sorts of licensed videos, let's start out with a bit of film history. The 1970s was the decade that defined what horror cinema would look like for the foreseeable future. With all-time classics like Halloween, Black Christmas, Alien, Carrie, and The Exorcist, filling seats in theatres across the world and laying the groundwork for the meteoric horror boom of the 1980s. While 1978's Halloween codified the slasher horror subgenre in the public consciousness, 1974 was basically the year slasher horror was born, as two films that we would understand today as the progenitors of slasher horror hit the silver screen. Black Christmas, which brought the invasive voyeurism that formed the lifeblood of Halloween, and the rather more famous Tobe Hooper flick, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The film follows a group of youngsters visiting family in the Texas hinterlands, only to be lured off the beaten track and killed by a family of cannibals living in a derelict farmhouse. The family weren't named until the sequel many years later, but we know them now as the Sawyers. The hitchhiker Nubbins, played by Edwin Neal, the cook Drayton, played by Jim Sydow, and Bubba or Leatherface, played by Gunnar Hansen. Like almost every good horror movie from that time period, it immediately ended up being banned in the UK, with the British Board of Film Classification only greenlighting the film for public viewing in 1999. And while many criticised the script, the stifling atmosphere and harrowing performances, especially by lead actress Marilyn Burns, were undeniably fantastic and really stand the test of time today. But there was one character who stood literally head and shoulders above the rest. One who would join the ranks of horror most celebrated characters and be the driving force behind the future franchise that would be the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The Masked Butcher Leatherface. This massive figure was the family's muscle, and the one behind most of the, chainsaw massacring going on in the movie. And his wordless brutality stood at odds with the cackling and eclectic performances of the rest of his family. Similar to Michael Myers, his inability to speak and the nature of his mask created an enigma around him, although he was a lot more emotive than Myers and gave us a bit more to work with in figuring him out. Throughout all his appearances in the movies, Leatherface is given a few key consistent traits. He's mentally disabled, almost never takes initiative himself, and relies on his family to tell him what to do, and is never seen without a mask made of cured human skin. What mask he's wearing typically depends on the role he's filling in his family at that time. In a way, it's a form of self-expression for him. For example, as the family starts to prepare dinner, you can see him in his old lady mask, with the pink shirt and blue apron as he fills a domestic role, whereas sitting down for dinner he wears his pretty lady mask, characterised by the lipstick on his mask and his dark suit. But without a doubt his most iconic look, and the one adapted for DVD's model for him, is the killing mask, with the thick plastic yellow apron and cattle hammer that indicate his role as the family's butcher and slaughterer. These are the three outfits he wears in the original film, and all of them have made their way into Dead by Daylight eventually, which is really nice, honestly. But it's important to remember here, unlike a lot of archetypical slashers, Leatherface does not work alone. Despite his popularity vastly exceeding that of his family, he's always relied on his family to give him a purpose. From Drayton and Nubbins in the original, to Ginny, who's effectively his caretaker in the 2022 movie distributed by Netflix. He's always moved to action by his desire to protect or avenge those around him, or because he fears their wrath, and never because of his own desire to shed blood. This is where the upcoming Texas Chainsaw Massacre game gets really interesting, because that's the first ASIN we've ever seen that's 3v4, with the killers playing not just the role of Bubba, but the entire family from the first film. I wanted to say Bubba for last because this game was originally slated for a release in October, so I was planning to cover Bubba and DVD at the same time. But since Gun Media pushed it back to March next year, that'll have to wait for another day. For what it's worth, it looks like a stellar adaptation that seeks to recapture the tension and atmosphere of the original film, which makes it all the more interesting to compare to how Dead by Daylight used Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or more accurately, how it didn't. Well, it kinda did, but not really for Leatherface, weirdly enough. The Hillbilly, one of Dead by Daylight's original cast of killers, drew a lot of inspiration from Leatherface in terms of his character and backstory. Most notably his weapons of choice with a chainsaw and hammer, and his map being a rancid farmhouse in the Deep South. While I still maintain the Hillbilly is a great original character who honestly rips off Hills Have Eyes way more than Texas Chainsaw, the inspiration, at least in part, is undeniable. Not to mention the use of meat hooks as the main method to sacrifice survivors, which was taken directly from the film. I do like that the Hillbilly remained different enough from Bubba, both in how he looked and how he played, to make adding Bubba as his own killer something they could actually do, a trick that replicated years later with Sadako following the spirit. But it was very clear that from the game's early days, these devs loved Texas Chainsaw and wanted their shiny new horror game to bear its marks. But if that's the case, why did Bubba's inclusion feel so half-assed, jammed in before Nightmare on Elm Street in a mid-chapter? Well, I've told this story before in my Freddy video, but that was a while ago now, so I think it's time for a refresher. Back in 2017, Behaviour was trying to get the rights to Freddy off New Line Cinema for a while, but New Line weren't budging, making Freddy's appearance in the DVD in time for Halloween less and less likely. Enter the rights holder for Texas Chainsaw Massacre, actually approaching Behaviour, something that doesn't usually happen, to try and get a full chapter for Leatherface in that October release spot. Behaviour immediately started work on a Leatherface chapter as a hybrid original and licensed chapter, pairing Leatherface with a new map and an original survivor who would go on to be Kate Denson. But at the last minute, New Line handed over the rights to the remake version of Freddy, and that put Behaviour in a pickle. They were working on two licensed chapters at once that were both scheduled for the Halloween release window. So they decided to give the full chapter slot to Nightmare on Elm Street, scrap the Texas Chainsaw map, push Kate back to being the survivor for the clown, and relegated Bubba to being a paragraph on his own, slotted in just before Freddy's launch. This resulted in what I would call DBD's roughest ever release period for both licenses. Leatherface, Freddy and Badham were all pretty bad and eventually received full reworks, and Freddy and Quentin's perks weren't a lot better. In effect, both chapters were rather half-baked, and there's a reason we didn't get much licensed content for a while afterwards until Behaviour expanded their staff and were able to accommodate multiple licensed collaborations at once going forwards. While Nightmare on Elm Street definitely suffered a lot from the lack of dev attention, it's abundantly clear that Bubba suffered the worst from it. Just look at his original add-ons. Almost all of them were just recycled from the Hillbilly, even in places where it made no sense at all. Like, for example, the Homemade Muffler, an add-on that reduces the noise of the chainsaw. Made sense on the Hillbilly because it often uses chainsaw to close the gap with you from a long distance, meaning you catch a survivor off guard by the chainsaw's noises being quieter than anticipated. Bubba, on the other hand, could only use his chainsaw effectively at point-blank range, meaning making it quieter does precisely jack shit because if they're 2 feet away from you, they can see you, or at least hear you revving the saw anyway. With the exception of 4 add-ons, the Beast Marks, Knife Scratches, Chili and Award-winning Chili, Bubba shared all his add-ons with Billy, which meant that they often didn't suit him and limited the power of an already pretty weak killer. Not only that, it meant that we missed out on most of the references and Easter eggs you'd expect from a licensed character's add-ons. The only ones that we got were the Chili and Award-winning Chili, which are references to Drayton's cooking in Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, where he feeds cooking competition judges chili made with human meat. And when Billy and Bubba got given separate add-on lists, Bubba kept the add-ons in the divorce, meaning we didn't get a look at any of the cool references we could have gotten from a modern add-on list. Look at a character like Wesker or Pinhead, and you could point out exactly where each add-on comes from, and it makes the killer as a whole feel more cohesive, something Bubba was robbed of. But while his power was underwhelming, his add-ons didn't fit him, and much of the content planned around him was scrapped or moved to another release, there's a couple of things that kept Bubba interesting and unique. The first one was the mask system, which, despite having to go due to the difficult implementation and the harassment that resulted from it, was an interesting idea, an evocative concept that made Bubba feel a bit more like Bubba. You could get masks for Bubba by sacrificing 25 of each of the original survivors, Dwight, Meg, Jake and Claudette, and those masks would be the peeled off faces of those survivors. This sounds like a great idea, in theory, until you take about 2 seconds to realise that giving your killer the means of wearing literal blackface is not a good idea, and giving the means to do so to a group of internet morons who like to harass black creators, or really anyone playing a black character, is even worse. Despite this absolutely awful oversight that resulted in the system's removal, they were a neat concept that gave Bubba something unique and evocative that you could only really get from something like a Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And on a brighter note, he's one of the more interesting licensed killers from a cosmetic standpoint. We got both Old Lady and Pretty Lady eventually, and I'm a huge fan of both as they're incredibly authentic to the source material. The other thing I care about that made Bubba really stand out though, is the lore that came with him, because it comes from an era where Behaviour actually cared about effectively integrating their licensed characters not just into the game, but into the Dead by Daylight universe. The Bubba lore segment takes place immediately after the events of the first film, as he's lashing out in frustration at the escape of Sally Hardesty. To me, this little bio is pretty special because it does something no Texas Chainsaw Massacre story has ever really done before. Explore the effects of isolation on Bubba Sawyer's mental state by giving a clear internal voice to a character who's typically non-verbal, and exploring his relationship with his abductor and new employer, the Entity. Most stories in DBD don't really do a lot when it comes to showing us the killer-entity relationship, and this goes to original characters as much as licensed ones. Most original characters are just too busy showing us who they are to bother delving into that sort of thing, and most licensed characters are sort of copy-pasted in, without a lot of attention paid to integrating their story with that of the Entity. Bubba is quite different. His story directly confronts his core motive from the original film, and logically extrapolates it to integrate him seamlessly into the Entity's realm, because it affirms the driving force behind Bubba's actions in every Texas Chainsaw film to date. Fear. Whether he's afraid of intruders breaking into the family home, or afraid of the abuse his family will inflict on him if he fails them. Bubba is ultimately robbed of most of his agency throughout his life as the dumb muscle of his family who's normally confined to the home. So what happens when a character like that is taken out of the home, away from the family that defines his entire life? To Bubba, that experience is not liberating, like being free from an abuser normally would be. It's horrifying. It upsets everything he knows and has gotten used to, and to him that is unthinkable. And now he's at the mercy of something far more terrifying than Drayton or Nubbins on their bad days. The horror of the entity. And then does something kinda clever with the concept. Bubba is terrified of the entity's power and what it might do to him if he fails it, but how different is that from his normal life? The idea of him being controlled by the fear of failure is surprisingly mature for what is essentially an excuse to put Bubba into the game. A psychological affirmation that this is why he's in the entity's realm and why he kills for it. That's the kind of treatment that often even original characters are not privileged to. And it was for arguably the least auspicious killer release of all time. Next to the post-it notes that accompany most modern licensed characters, Bubba is woven into the world of DBD like he was always meant to be there, and I'm so glad he's here. In fact, it got me thinking about what a full Texas Chainsaw Massacre chapter would have looked like if it had been chosen over Nightmare on Elm Street. Imagine how gorgeous the Sawyer house could have been as a map. Maybe a 6th map in the Coldwind realm with all the animal bones, and maybe the Hardesty's camper van or even Drayton's gas station as a second main building. Imagine if Kay had come in as a victim of the family, who had survived her experience at the Sawyer house only to be spat out in the entity's realm. Imagine if Bubba's add-ons had evoked Texas Chainsaw fully, and given us Franklin's knife or Nubbin's camera as add-ons. Imagine if we could have gotten more cosmetics from other films in the franchise. The Golden Saw from 3. We could have had one of those memorable licensed chapters in the game's history. A hybrid of original and licensed content, the likes of which we only got years later with Ghostface. But as it stands, Bubba is up there with Evil Dead and Crypt TV as the biggest squandered licensed opportunity we've ever had. So, why do people remember him? I think a lot of it is simply simplicity. Leatherface squeaked out between 2 chapters without a lot of fanfare, which meant he didn't really get the attention he deserved, but also meant that the expectations that are normally placed on licensed killers pretty much didn't exist. Like, look at how far in advance Ringu got announced as our first chapter of 2022. It got announced on December the 15th, just over 2 weeks after Artist came out, and didn't come out until March the 8th, meaning we had almost 3 months of waiting for a chapter that was probably the most niche horror license to ever to get a full chapter, and landed with a mediocre splash as a result because it didn't fit the expectations of a full chapter announced months in advance. Leatherface wasn't greeted with that pomp and circumstance. He just rocked up and started soaring. So players are more able to take him on his own merit rather than being let down by the hype machine. It does help that Texas Chainsaw isn't exactly the most popular license DVD's ever had, because while it's a very well known name and Leatherface is an icon of horror for sure, a lot of people haven't actually watched the movie for one reason or another. He certainly doesn't have the brand recognition of someone like Freddy Krueger or Michael Myers, so in many ways his suit's just being slipped into the game out of nowhere. It also helps that his power is pretty easy to use, and because he came in barbecue and chili, a perk that was until recently a staple of Killer Bill's due to the massive help it gave with the blood point grind, basically everyone has him, and basically anyone can play him, making him a very appealing killer for brand new players, especially if they know the license and are already familiar with the character. He's a very simple character. No frills, no baggage, and that's exactly what Bubba should be at his core. A blunt instrument does not need a ton of bells and whistles to be appealing to people who just want Chainsaw to go brr. And if that means taking the role of a classic horror icon, then more the better. It's just like his lore, really. It doesn't really have any pretensions. It doesn't try to be anything it isn't, and that's something to seriously admire. In many ways, I think it's the opposite of Pinhead, the other fully licensed character to come into the game on his own. Pinhead is a fantastic licensed adaptation. I'd argue the best the game's ever had. But he is 15 gimmicks stacked on top of each other trying to get in on one cinema ticket. The lament configuration, the million little references to the movies in the add-ons and score events, the chatterer legendary with the voice lines, the unique killer instinct while solving the box, the moron not leaving behind a body. Hell, they got Doug Bradley in to voice Pinhead again. That is such a blindingly egregious piece of fan service. He is a complicated killer, both in terms of his gameplay and in terms of his wider artistic and power design, and, like Bubba, comes from a license that's not exactly at the top of behaviour's lineup, meaning that he's only played by the psychopaths who run engineers fang every game, or pretentious people who read like Hellraiser and are utterly besotted with unnecessary complexities on the level of a Bond villain. Me, I'm pretentious, people. I am self-reporting right now. Bubba is about as far from pretentious as you can get. He is big man with chainsaw who camp survivor and eat chili, and that is all we ever need of him. As in rumblings that the new Texas Chainsaw game may result in the license we had to Leatherface being lost in the same way we lost Stranger Things. And while I do think that's unlikely, if it was to happen, it would be the end of an era, saying goodbye to an institution of this game who's been in it longer than many of us have. And while I'm looking forward to whatever those funny fellows at Gun Media are cooking up, sometimes it pays to remember the simple things. Like what's been cooking up right here for years in Dead by Daylight. So that's everything I have to say about Leatherface, and with that, my backlog of killers is finally complete. This doesn't mean I'm not going to go back and recover some characters, especially if they do end up getting tomes, but it's strange to be at this position. It's been just over 2 years since I started this channel, and it's a strange place to find myself. But whatever comes next, I'm very much looking forward to it. If you want to see what's coming, then please do subscribe if you haven't already, ring that little notification bell, and check all my socials in the description. And before we go, another thank you to Manscaped for sponsoring this video and letting me keep doing what I'm doing. If you want to try out their frankly excellent products, the link is in the description and the pinned comment, and don't forget code PIXEL20 for 20% off and free shipping. Lore-friendly builds for Sadako is the next video that'll be coming out, but after that, who knows? Hope to see you then, whatever it is. So I'll see you around.